Get some insight
Yes.
from our panel. John, what are you thinking about this verdict that we just heard?
Well, if I'm James Crumbley, I'm very nervous right now because this obviously doesn't bode well for him because his trial is coming up next, and he's going to have some serious conversations with his attorney. For Ms. Crumbley, the appellate process is going to begin for her. This case has the Michigan Supreme Court written all over it. You know, I clerked up at the Michigan Supreme Court when I first started. Cases like this of first impression, which this case is, not just in Michigan but nationally, is likely going to make it to the Michigan Supreme Court and will have to be decided ultimately by then. Of course, that doesn't give her much hope right now because she's going to be going to jail.
How does this bode for her husband, James, as his trial approaches on March 5th?
Well, what's going to be difficult for defendant Crumbley, James Crumbley, is trying to work out a plea on this case because likely the prosecutor will not allow him to plead guilty to merely one count, for instance, and a reduced sentence because there are 4 victims in this case, and the prosecution will be very likely concerned with each and every victim having been dealt justice, and that's why it's difficult for him to enter a plea, since the only charge for James Crumbley is involuntary manslaughter. So I don't anticipate there'll be a plea other than plead guilty to all 4 counts straight up and possibly work out something regarding a sentence, a reduced sentence, and waiving his appellate rights. That's a possibility, but probably not a good one, given the fact that they just received guilty verdicts on all 4 counts on Jennifer Crumbley. I think the case is stronger against James Crumbley.
Wow. And Rick, this is something we've been obviously watching from the beginning. You were not too surprised by this verdict. As we mentioned too, John, you never know how these things are going to go, but you felt pretty strongly that this would be the outcome.
Yeah, right from day one, in the presentation of the evidence by the prosecution, early on, it seemed like it was coming in seriatim and overflowing. There were a few objections. The objections that were made were not effective. I think the defense could have been a lot stronger. I think they could have been infinitely more prepared throughout. I think there were admissions throughout that the defense attorney was unprepared. In fact, on a couple of exhibits, the one exhibit that was brought in of the surveillance with the victims being shown, the shooter shooting and killing the 4 victims, she broke down in tears, the defense attorney, and then got up and admitted, I had never seen this evidence before, which was, incredible. Incredible to me and incredible to the other attorney who was sitting on the panel that day. So I think the prosecution did present a very coherent, concise, clear case and in a very effective manner. And I would anticipate that they'll do the same, and that any hitches or glitches that they had in this case, I think they'll improve upon in James Crumbley's case.
Now, talking about jury selection for James Crumbley's case, I mean, people will know that this was the outcome for Jennifer Crumbley today. What challenges will they face in selecting a jury?
Sure, anytime you have a high publicity case like this, jury selection is going to be incredibly difficult for the defense. It's probably going to take a lot longer. The judge is going to have to give them a lot more time to try to impanel a fair jury. And so I would plan on seeing an extensive, lengthy jury selection process for the James Crumbley trial. Possibly even a motion for a change of venue would not be unheard of in situations such as this, but they're very rarely granted, and I doubt they will be granted here.
Yeah, they did file one in this case. It was denied. I thought there would be a much more extensive voir dire selection of a jury. In this case, they had handwritten questionnaires, but this jury selection was exceedingly quick. In Jennifer Crumbley's case, I would have thought it would have taken a couple of weeks at least to impanel a jury. I think it was just a couple of days or a day and a half to impanel a jury.
And remind us some of the things that they're asked generally.
You know, it depends on the latitude that the judge gives you, but generally an attorney has wide latitude in their voir dire, and you can ask anything. In this particular case, there was a lot of focus on guns, parental obligations, and parental duties, things of that nature. I would expect similar type questioning But I would expect to see a more extensive voir dire. It's absolutely pivotal. It's one of the most important parts of getting a fair trial for the defense and for the prosecution, for that matter, in a case like this. But I mean, I've routinely seen, even on civil cases, voir dire that can go longer than a day, can go multiple days. Criminal cases, it should be even longer.
If you are an attorney for James, what is your mindset right now? How do you even try to tackle this or approach this situation, Rick?
Well, you have to make a decision whether you want to approach the prosecution about resolving the case pre-trial, but that's a difficult row to hoe in this case. So, you know, I would just buckle up for trial, and you know, the attenuation in this case between knowledge and the consequences of the act of shooter, I think is a leap of faith, and I think that there wasn't enough done by the defense to broaden that gap, and I think that's where the whole case lies. There's that Kierkegaardian leap of faith between what Mrs. Crumbley was aware of and the natural consequences by not taking ordinary care, and I don't think that was exploited enough in this case.
And when can we expect sentencing, and what would that look like in terms of time?
Well, the judge will set a date for sentencing, and often these dates can get moved. It can be fluid. They can set a date, and then the date gets moved, and one side asks for a continuance. So it'll be up to the judge to set a sentencing date, and then we might see that moved in the future.
Okay. And then moving forward, can we assume that Jennifer Crumbley will appeal this?
Yes.
Yes.
Beyond a shadow of a doubt.
And
yeah.
she'll have a separate attorney for that?
She should have a separate attorney for that, because one of the issues would be ineffective assistance of counsel. And I don't think that the attorney who tried the case will say that she was ineffective on appeal. So yeah, you should always have a separate attorney. In this case in particular, should have a separate attorney.
All right, and in continuing our team coverage, let's go now to our Andres Gutierrez, who is outside of the courthouse with more on what he is seeing on his end. Andres?
Yeah, we had just wrapped up lunch, Terrence, when a word came that they had reached a verdict around 1:15, and the judge indicated that this was going to move pretty quickly, which is what happened in that courtroom. So we had the word that from the court administrator that they had reached a verdict, and then shortly after, you had 13 deputies start lining the perimeter of that courtroom. Jennifer Crumbley then walked in, spoke to her attorney, Shannon Smith, and then the jury was brought in, the four-person reading all 4 counts, finding them guilty on involuntary manslaughter. Didn't delve as to which theory they had to prove, because remember, yesterday they had that question as to whether they had to prove whether she was just failed to neglect her legal duty as a parent to take care of her child, or if she didn't properly store the guns. That was not discussed here during the verdict being read. So now sentencing being set for April 9th, so it will happen that morning, and because involuntary manslaughter carries a punishment of up to 15 years, it is possible that she could get up to 60 years in prison. We'll all see how that pans out on sentencing, again, happening April 9th. Only one of the victim's family was in the courtroom. Justin Chilling's father, actually the prosecution, after it all wrapped up, shook his hand as they were all walking out. But that is the only family member of one of the victims that was in the courtroom as this verdict was read. Pretty subdued, by the way. There was no gasp. There was nothing, no one kind of screamed. It was a subdued emotion in that courtroom as that verdict was read. Again, pretty quick process. So that's what it was like being in that courtroom. For now, we're going to send it back to you.